Thanks, Mr. President. I thank the senator from Alabama for his leadership and his remarks. Mr. President, the President of the United States has gotten the world's attention with his tariffs. He met today with the President of the European Union. But what I think should get more attention than the tariffs is President Trump's solution to the tariffs. Zero tariffs, zero barriers, which, as the President said at the G7 summit in May, is the way it should be. He said that again last night and today again. After his meeting with the President of the European Union in the Oval Office, President Trump said, quote, "If we could have no tariffs and no barriers and no subsidies, the United States would be extremely pleased." Well, so would I, Mr. President, but that's not what's happening. Piling tariffs on top of tariffs with no end in sight is a trade war and will hurt American workers. But the basis of the President's long-term solution is reciprocity, a word he's also used many times, which means when it comes to trade, other countries should do for the United States what the United States does for them. Taking steps in the direction of reciprocity rather than a trade war would be much better for the American worker. Today I've come to the floor with Senator Jones to introduce legislation that would delay the administration's proposed 25% tariff on automobiles and auto parts imported from other countries into the United States until the President has the benefit of a second opinion from the International Trade Commission about the effect those tariffs would have on the more than 7 million Americans who work in the auto industry. After the President and the Congress have received the International Trade Commission study and the President has this second opinion, then he may still continue with the Section 232 investigation if he chooses to do so. I have no doubt there's a trade problem. Some countries are taking advantage of us. I also have no doubt that shooting yourself in both feet at once is not the right solution to our problem, which is what would happen if we continue these tariffs for a long time. That's not the best way to solve the problem. These tariffs are dangerous. These tariffs are going to cost us jobs. These tariffs are going to lower our family incomes. These tariffs are going to undo much of the good that the President and the Congress have done during the last year and a half to create this booming economy, which is booming like none of us have seen for a long, long time. We don't want to interrupt that. A better strategy is the one that the President himself has suggested and I believe would be much more effective. Insist on reciprocity. Say to other countries, do for our country what we do for you, just as he did at the G7 summit. No tariffs, no barriers, that's the way it should be, just as he said today to the President of the European Union. May I suggest a first step in that direction? It might be to agree on the same tariffs on light trucks and cars that are traded between the United States and the European Union. Currently, the European Union levies a 10% tariff on light trucks that come from the United States, and the U.S. levies a 25% tariff on trucks imported from the European Union. Similarly, the European Union levies a 10% tariff on cars imported from this country. The U.S. levies a 2.5% tariff on cars that come to us from Europe. A first step toward the President's zero tariff solution would be to make these tariffs the same. Now, my late friend Alex Haley once told me that if I began a speech by saying, instead of making a speech, let me tell you a story, someone might actually listen to what I have to say. So let me tell you a story about how tariffs affect Tennessee. This is a story about a Canadian company, Onward Manufacturing Company, that 8 years ago had a choice between locating its new plant either in the United States or in China. The company chose Dixon, Tennessee, where today about 300 Tennesseans have good-paying jobs making Broil King gas grills, which the company then exports to Canada and Europe. The company decided on Tennessee instead of China because NAFTA made it possible, the North American Free Trade Agreement made it possible to buy materials and parts to manufacture their grills in the U.S. and Canada without paying tariffs. There's the advantage of zero tariffs. Broil King buys the steel and aluminum the company makes, uses to make grills from United States producers. But in 2016, our country imposed tariffs on steel from China that's used to manufacture grills. That increased the cost of imported steel. That had the effect of increasing the price of steel made in the U.S. Then on March 23rd of this year, this country imposed another 25% tariff on steel and 10% on aluminum after the Commerce Department's Section 232 investigation concluded that those imports were a threat to national security. This also had the effect of raising the price of steel and aluminum that Broil King used to make gas grills in Dixon, Tennessee. So prices for U.S.-produced steel that Broil King buys are up 40% since January, according to the trade publication Steel Benchmark. This is called shooting yourself in one foot. Now here goes the other foot. Europe and Canada then responded to the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum by imposing tariffs on U.S. products sold in Europe and Canada, including gas grills. Broil King exports to Canada and Europe. Remember, they located their plant here so they could do that. About 60% of the grills the company makes in Tennessee. The company told me last week they're losing money on every grill they sell in Europe because of the combination of steel and aluminum tariffs and the response by Europe and Canada. Broil King is also hurt by the March 2018 announcement tariffs would be imposed on $50 billion by the United States on Chinese goods because the company buys some parts from China that it used to make gas grills in Tennessee. So now here's what's causing the owners of Broil King to wonder why they ever decided to locate a plant in Dixon, Tennessee instead of China. Because the new U.S. tariffs do not apply to barbecue gas grills made in China that are already assembled, which means that every one of Broil King's competitors in China can import their grills into the United States without any tariff at all. So here's the bottom line. These new tariffs make it difficult to make a profit on gas grills in Dixon, Tennessee, and leave the U.S. market wide open for gas grills made in China. That's what happened to one small company that employs 300 Tennesseans, buys its steel and aluminum from U.S. suppliers when we begin piling tariffs on top of tariffs with no end in sight. That's what happens with a trade war. And that's why I like what the President said this morning to the President of the European Union. If we could have no tariffs and no barriers and no subsidies, the President said, the United States would be extremely pleased. So would workers in Tennessee. That would be better for the 300 workers in Dixon. Now here's another story, Electrolux. I visited Springfield, Tennessee outside Nashville a few weeks ago. The mayor and the Chamber of Commerce officials rushed up to me. The new tariffs on steel had been announced, and the largest employer in Springfield, Electrolux, making home supplies, had canceled a $250 million expansion. Electrolux buys all of its steel from U.S. suppliers, but of course, when you raise the price on imported steel, the price of U.S. steel also goes up, and Electrolux concluded that it could not be competitive in the U.S. market and with exports at the higher price. Of course, it sounds good to say that putting a 10% tariff on Chinese-made goods is good for us, but Electrolux also buys some components made in China. And last week, the company said the latest U.S. tariffs on Chinese-made goods will cost the company $10 million during the second half of this year if the proposed 10% tariffs go into effect after a comment period ending in late August. That's Electrolux in Springfield, Tennessee. Now, if we were moving toward a policy of reciprocity, do for us what we do for you, there'd be zero tariffs. And the people of Springfield would have a $250 million expansion and the jobs that come with it instead of a 25% tax on the U.S. steel that Electrolux buys. Then there's stories about our auto companies. We have 3 big tire companies in Tennessee. Bridgestone is one of them, 1,700 employees. I'll talk about it for just a moment. Bridgestone tires all have steel cord to make them stronger. None of that steel is produced in the United States. All of it is imported. Now all of it has a 25% tax. Who pays that? The American consumer. The same must be true for every tire-making company. Here's one more story. You've probably heard of Bush Brothers Beans. They can 1/3 of all the beans in the United States. Their plant's in Chestnut Hill in the mountains of East Tennessee, near where I live. The cans are made of tin-plated steel. That's mostly imported. There's not enough produced in the United States. Bush Brothers estimates the new tariff on steel will reduce its revenues and raise prices by as much as 8%. Even the workers in Chestnut Hill who can 1/3 of all the beans in the U.S. would benefit from a zero tariff policy, such as the one the President talked about today, instead of a trade war that piles tariffs on top of tariffs. Then we have many more stories. We have 900 auto parts suppliers in Tennessee. They're in 88 of our 95 counties. They almost all use steel and aluminum. When the prices go up, revenues and profits go down. That has an effect on 136,000 Tennesseans. That's the people who work in our automotive industry. That's 1/3 of our entire manufacturing workforce. Tariffs are taxes, Mr. President, pure and simple. Taxes we pay. Existing tariffs on steel and aluminum are bad enough, but nothing could do more damage to Tennessee's auto industry than the proposed tariffs on imported automobiles and automotive parts. Those combined with tariffs on steel and aluminum already imposed will cost us jobs, lower our family incomes. I respectfully said to President Trump, both publicly and privately, that he, with the Republican Congress, have accomplished an enormous amount in 18 months. I'm very proud of that. This booming economy is something that benefits so many Americans. But I am afraid that if we do not move quickly toward the President's announced long-term goal of no tariffs, and if we continue to pile tariffs on top of tariffs, that we will take this economy in exactly the opposite direction and undo much of the good that the Republican President and the Republican Congress have already done. What would take us in the right direction is the goal of reciprocity that the President talked about today. That is why, in the meantime, until we shift gears into this long-term goal of no tariffs, no subsidies, no barriers, and take steps toward it, Senator Jones and I have developed this bill to make sure the President has all the facts before him before he makes a decision on the proposed 25% tariff on imported cars and parts. It simply requires the Commerce Department's investigation to be delayed while we get more facts about the impact of the automotive industry of these tariffs. The President's right to focus on China. China steals our intellectual property. It imposes other trade barriers. But tariffs on steel and aluminum and uncertainty surrounding the renegotiation of NAFTA threaten to destroy many more U.S. jobs than it might save. We should remember the lessons of history. Presidents have tried this before. When I first came to the Senate, President George W. Bush imposed steel tariffs. Within a year, he dropped the idea because the tariffs destroyed more jobs in the automotive industry than existed in the steel industry at that time, according to the Consuming Industries Trade Action Coalition. Now, let's look at today. Last year, U.S. steel industry employed about 139 Americans. According to the Congressional Research Service, about 162,000 worked in the aluminum industry. That's around 300 Americans who work in the steel and aluminum industry. To put this in perspective, the automotive industry employs 20 times that many Americans, more than 7 million, according to the Auto Alliance. 136,000 of those, as I have said, are Tennesseans. Mr. President, there are only 8 aluminum smelting plants operating in the United States that employ Americans. They employ about 4,000. 7 of those are actually producing. 1 is curtailed. Alcoa, which produces about half the aluminum produced in the United States, doesn't even want the tariffs. It makes me wonder who does want the tariffs on aluminum. The main reason those plants, those smelting plants have closed, one of them's in my hometown. My father worked at it for 40 years. It has nothing to do with trade. It's because aluminum plants need a lot of cheap electricity to run through the bauxite ore to make aluminum ingots. And they can't buy that electricity that cheap in the United States. The 10% tariff already imposed on aluminum is not nearly enough to offset the cost of electricity. The reason I've been so outspoken about this is because no state is more likely to be more damaged by tariffs on aluminum and steel and on automobiles and auto parts than Tennessee. In many ways, over the last 40 years, we have become the nation's #1 auto state, with our more than 136,000 Tennesseans working in the automotive industry. Three big assembly plants, General Motors, Volkswagen, and Nissan, 929 auto suppliers in 88 of our 95 counties. As Senator Jones said, 35 years ago, we were the third poorest state, and textile plants were moving overseas. Things looked bleak for us. In came the auto industry with better paying jobs, and our family incomes have been going up ever since in almost every county. I don't want to see that hurt. Tennesseans who work in the auto industry would benefit, as they have under NAFTA, from zero tariffs instead of a trade war that piles tariffs on top of tariffs. So, Mr. President, in conclusion, the President has gotten the world's attention with his tariffs. As a tactic, perhaps he's wise to do that. He had the President of the European Union in his office today. But what should get more attention, and what I hope gets more attention also from the President, is the solution that he talked about again today. If we could have no tariffs and no barriers and no subsidies, the President said, the United States would be extremely pleased. That's the way it should be. Let's move toward that goal as rapidly as we can. Piling tariffs on top of tariffs with no end in sight is a trade war. It hurts American workers. But the basis of the President's solution is reciprocity, a word he's used many times, which means when it comes to trade, other countries should do for the United States what we do for them. Taking step in that direction would be the right way to go. In the meantime, the bill that Senator Jones and I have introduced will make certain that President Trump has before him all the facts, in effect, a second opinion, before he makes a decision regarding the proposed 25% tariffs on imported automobiles and automotive parts. Thank the President, and I yield the floor.